But now let's talk about indexing and slicing in Python NumPy arrays. So as you can see, here is an array, and you can see that these are the indices of these values. As you know, in Python programming language, indexing starts at 0. So Python starts counting at 0. So this is the value at index 0. This is the value at index 1. This is the value at index 2. And this is the value at index 3. And suppose that we want to index to this value. In order to do so, we simply type x and we pass 0 in a square bracket. It means we want to index to that value. So now if I run the code, you can see the value at index 0 of the x is 60. And for example, the value at index 2 is 114. And also remember that we have negative indices in Python NumPy arrays. So you can see the last element, the index of the last element is -1. The index of this value, which is the value before the last element, is -2, and etc. So for example, this is -3 and -4. And if you want the philosophy of these negative indices, you can see that the first index is 0. If you go to the right, you can see the indices increases. But if you want to go to the left, we don't have any value to the left. So as a matter of fact, we start from the end. So the index of the last element is -1. And if you go to the left, the negative indices will increase. So -1, -2, -3, and -4. So now, for example, if I want to index to the last element, I can simply type x -1. So now if I run the code, you can see the last element is 40. And now let's talk about slicing in NumPy arrays. So suppose that we want this slice of the array. So you can see the indices of these values is 0 all the way up to 2. So in order to do so, in order to slice to that numbers, so we can simply pass 0 all the way up to 3. And maybe you ask why I have typed 3 and not 2, because this value is exclusive. So if you want to include 2, you should write 3, because this value is exclusive. So now if I run the code, you can see that these are the values. So now let's take another example. Suppose that I want these values. So if I want these values, I can simply pass the values at index 1 all the way up to, and remember that you shouldn't write 3 because this second value is exclusive. So if you want to include 3, then you should write 4, because remember that this value, this second value after the colon, is exclusive. So if I run the code, you can see here's the output. And in this special case, which we want the values from index 1 all the way up to the end of the array, we can simply delete this, and it means that we want the values from index 1 all the way up to the end of the array. So now if I run the code, you can see here's the output. And now suppose that I want the values from the beginning of the array all the way up to index 2. So I can simply type all the way up to index 3. So you can see from the beginning of the array all the way up to index 3. And again, remember that this one is exclusive, so because you want to include 2, we should write 3. So now it is going to index these values, I mean from the beginning of the array all the way up to index 2. And again, remember that this one is exclusive. So if I run a code, you can see here is the output. And here is another question. Can we use negative indices for slicing? Of course we can. For example, suppose that we want to index these values. So as you can see, the indices of these values, if we want to talk about the negative indices, is -4 and -3. So if you want to get this slice of the array, we can simply type the values from index -4 all the way up to -2. Remember that you shouldn't write -3 because this second value is exclusive. You should write -2. So if you want these values, with these indices, you should simply type -4 all the way up to -2 because this value is exclusive. So now if I run the code, you can see here's the output. But now let's talk about the slicing and also indexing in a two-dimensional array. So as you can see, this is a matrix, or as a matter of fact, a two-dimensional array, and we want to talk about the slicing and indexing. So again, remember that Python starts counting at 0. So it says this is row 0, this is row 1, and this is row 2. And also this is column 0, column 1, and column 2. So remember, Python starts counting at 0. So suppose that we want to index to this value. So as you can see, this value is at row 2 and column 2. So we can simply type print and x and the row index is 2 and also the column index is 2. So if I run a code, you can see the corresponding value is 14. And now suppose that I want to index to this value. So you can see the corresponding row for that is 1. And the corresponding column is 0. So now if I run a code, you can see the value is 114. So that's it. But now suppose that I want these values. So as you can see, these values are at row 0. So we simply type row 0. And which columns? The columns are the column 0 all the way up to column 1. So we simply type 0 all the way up to column 2. And remember that because this value is exclusive, you shouldn't write 1, because if you want to include 1, you should write 2, because the second value is exclusive. So now if I run a code, you can see we have indexed these values. And also remember that we can do that in a simpler way. We can delete this, and it means that from the first column all the way up to column 1. And again, remember that this one is exclusive, and because of that reason I say all the way up to column 1, because this one is exclusive. So now if I run a code, you can see here are the values. And now let's talk about another example. Suppose that we want to get this slice of the array, which you can see 10 and 14. So you can see these values are at column 2. So let's put a comma. In the first position, we should talk about the rows, and in the second position, I mean after the comma, we should talk about the columns. So those values are at column 2. So that's it. But which rows we are talking about? So those are row 1 all the way up to row 2. So we can simply type 1 all the way up to 3. And again, remember that this one is exclusive, and because we want to include 2, we simply write 3. So now if I run a code, you can see here is the output, and you can see that we have indexed those values. And also remember that there is a better way, or let's say a simpler way for doing that, and we can delete this, and it means that we want the rows at index 1 all the way up to the end. And also those values are located in the column which its index is 2. So now once again, if I run a code, you can see here is the output. But now let's talk about indexing in a three-dimensional array. So if you remember, I've told you that a three-dimensional array is a bunch of two-dimensional arrays, or as a matter of fact, a three-dimensional array is a bunch of matrices. So you can see this is the first matrix inside that array, and this is the second matrix inside that array. So suppose that I want to index to this one. So if you remember, Python starts counting at 0. It says this is matrix 0 and this is matrix at index 1. So if I want to index this one, I can simply pass x sub 1. And now if I run a code, you can see we have indexed to this element, I mean this matrix. But now suppose that we want to index to this value. So as you can see, this value is in the matrix, which the corresponding index for this matrix is 1. So that's it. And inside this matrix, you can see that this value is at row 0, so it is at row 0, and also column 1, so we pass 1. So now if I run a code, you can see here's the output, and you can see that we have indexed to this value. But now let's talk about a very important terminology, which we are going to use that terminology in future parts. And that terminology and that term, which is very important, is axis. So because we don't have rows and columns for higher dimensions, because rows and columns are for two-dimensional arrays. So row is the first dimension and column is the second dimension. So for higher dimensions, for example, like a 3-dimensional array, a 4-dimensional array, and etc., we don't have rows and columns. So if we want to use a general term for all of the dimensions, for example, for 1-dimensional, for 2-dimensional, for 3-dimensional, and etc., we use the word, or let's say the term, axis. So for example, we say that this is axis 0, axis 1, and axis 2. Now I really suggest you to watch this video, which is on the screen now.